In this video, I'm attempting one of my most ambitious projects yet, and once again going outside the realm of having any idea what I'm doing, in an attempt at making the world's most unique patio. Well, it's been over a year since I've ripped up my parents' backyard with some ridiculous YouTube project, so I think it's time to get on that again. As a family, we've been using this fire pit for as long as I can literally remember. So I think it's time to finally update this space to fit in with the stone hot tub and sauna and all the other stuff I've built in their house. So first I'm measuring out where the new patio is going to go. And to make a perfect circle for this, I have this 14-foot board with a bolt in the middle. And then as I rotate this around, this will give me a perfect circle with a 7-foot radius, so I marked that out with some line paint. I also added on a walkway from the existing patio, and I just eyeballed that. Now, there would have been a time where I likely would have dug this whole thing out by hand. But I'm nearly 30 now, and more importantly, my shoulder and neck have been bugging me pretty severely all year, so I'm going to bring in some heavy equipment to make this digging a lot easier. So this whole patio bed is getting dug down about 6 or 7 inches, and we first were trucking this out with a wheelbarrow, but that presented some problems, so we went out to my dad's shop and picked up this dump trailer to make this process a little easier as well. So after a few hours of digging with the excavator, I had most of this material removed, so I went around with a shovel and just cleaned up this edge so that was fairly perfect and I don't have to do any grass touch-up. Now that I have this whole bed at a pretty consistent 7 inches, we're going to go ahead and install some industrial grade landscape fabric to stop any weeds from poking up through this patio in the future. Now it's time for my stone delivery, so for this patio I'm using some big oversize flagstone, and then I have some aggregates to go underneath this for the patio bed. So the first thing I'm putting in is this 3/4 inch clear gravel, and clear just means there's no stones or smaller sand in this, so it's going to drain really well. So we filled up this patio bed with about 3.5 or 4 inches of this clear gravel. And then we have this high performance bed, which is a similar clear aggregate, but more like a 1/4 inch. And then we're going to do another 2 inches on top of this with this HPB. I used a long board and a 2x4 to screed this to grade with about 1.5 inch drop. Different climates are going to call for a lot different preparation of the patio bed. If you live in a place that doesn't have frost, you can probably get away with a lot less prep, but we have pretty harsh winters here, so this thick bed with good drainage is going to prevent the frost heave. And that's the initial preparation done for the patio. So now I'm going to start making the mold that's going to cast the concrete body of the fire pit. So I have this scrap piece of OSB and I'm marking out the center point. And then I just have this thin scrap piece of wood that I'm going to screw into the center point and measure out my inner and outer radius. Then I can mark that onto my OSB and cut it out with a jigsaw. Then I'm taking a 2x4 and cutting it up into a bunch of even lengths that's going to be the height of the fire pit. I think I made that about 12 or 14 inches. Then I'm going to screw these into my pieces of OSB that will basically construct my mold shell. So with these two pieces made, I have an inner and outer piece of the mold, and now I just have to skin these so that they'll hold concrete. So for the skin, I have this 1/8 inch MDF with this white melamine coating on it. This stuff has some pretty good bend for the curves I need, and the melamine coating should make it pretty easy to remove from the concrete once it's cured. So I ripped off a few pieces of this and screwed them around the shells. Now this mold's pretty much ready for some concrete after one more thing. I have some of this 1.5 inch steel tubing that I have lying around the shop. So I cut out 4 even lengths of this, and then I cut some holes in the outer shell of the mold. And then fed some tubing into the hole, and this will act as the air intakes for the fire pit and aid in its smokelessness. I also cut out some of these wooden fingers that I'll screw into the frame to hold the steel tubing in place while the concrete's put in around it. So now it's time to fill this mold with concrete. I have some of this crack-resistant Quickcrete, which is basically just normal concrete, but it has some fiberglass fibers mixed into it that gives it some more structural strength and resist cracking under the heat, hopefully. I'm sure just the normal Quickcrete bags would work for this also, but these were just a few bucks extra, so why not try to future-proof it. So we mixed the concrete mix with some water until we had a nice pudding-like consistency, and then started filling in the mold. My brother would scoop in scoops of concrete, and I would go around with a smaller shovel and a dowel and just kind of vibrate that and work it into place so there's not any large air pockets. This used about 7 bags of concrete, and we actually decided to stop a couple inches from the top of the mold just because I thought it was going to be too high for the fire pit. Now I'll leave that to cure a little. And a few days later, that's set up nicely, so I came back and removed the mold. My steel tubing idea worked perfectly for the air intakes. I just wish I would have used a little bit of bigger tubing for more airflow, but live and learn. And now we're ready to move on to the next step, which is going to be building some benches that will eventually match the stone fire pit. So the toughest part of building these is going to be the curve to match the radius of the patio. So I have some 2x8 cedar in the shop. You could use pressure treated, it'd be quite a bit cheaper. I just had this laying around, so I'm going to use it. So I cut up 3 lengths of these 2x8s, and then I'm going to drill some pocket holes using this pocket hole jig up and down the inside edges of each piece. Then I'm fusing these 3 pieces together using some wood glue, and then some pocket hole screws for a mechanical connection that'll also help the glue bond better. After the glue's set up for a couple hours, I can start working on the curves. So using a spare 2x4, I screwed this in at the far end of the bench to be my center point, and then measured out my inside and outside radius, and basically using this 2x4 as a big compass. Then I'll be able to use that to trace my radii onto the laminated board. So I cut that out using a fast cut blade on my jigsaw and then quickly duplicated it. And then I cut up a bunch of even length 2x4s to be my studs. So I'm doing pretty much the same thing I did with the fire pit mold, screwing each one of these studs in with a couple of 3-inch deck screws. And once I had all the studs fastened to the bottom plate, I flipped it over and attached the top plate the same way. And that should be a plenty solid base for my benches, even with the weight of the stone and concrete that's about to be added to them. This frame should last an easy 50 years or so. And then I basically just repeated this process again to make the second bench. The only difference with this one is a slight portion of the bench is elevated a little bit higher to be a tabletop. So on the outside of these benches, I'm going to have a real limestone veneer. So to properly attach that veneer, I'm going to wrap these frames in some 1/2-inch concrete board. So the most dust-free way to cut the cement board is to score it a bunch of times with a sharp knife. And then I'll just prop a board underneath that cut line and break it along the score. Then I can cut that backside free and start piecing these onto the benches. This board is slightly bendable, so I was able to bend it around my 6 or 7 foot radiuses. And I'm attaching it every 6 inches or so along a stud with some concrete board screws. Now I'm unloading my stone veneer. I got this from a local company for about $2,000. And this is really what's going to make these benches and the fire pit look like they're made entirely out of stone. So a stone veneer is essentially just a real stone face that's been sawn off the stone, so it's about 1 inch thick, which makes it a lot lighter and a little more versatile of a aesthetic product. So this is going to be attached to the concrete or the concrete board using some veneer mortar. And I finally broke down and got a cement mixer, because we have a few more bags of this to mix up, as well as quite a few bags of concrete, and whatever's going on in my neck was not loving manual mixing. Again though, totally possible to do without. But is that way easier? I should have got one a long time ago. So veneer stone is pretty straightforward to install. I just back butter the stone with some mortar, and I had to put on quite a bit extra for this because I'm going around a curved surface. On flat, you could get away with a lot less mortar. And then I'd wet down the concrete or the concrete board it's being applied to, and press that stone into place and use my finger to remove any of the squeezed out excess. Then by the end of the day, that should be stuck on there permanently. It's a bit of a puzzle to get this all to fit and look nicely. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it is nice if you match up the edges of the stones so that there's as little grout gaps as possible. For the square corners, you can buy these corners that are literally that, just a sawn-off corner of stone that'll wrap around this perfectly. So I spent the next couple days just piecing in this puzzle until my fire pit and the 2 benches were covered in stone. So now I'm going to make the concrete tops for the fire pit and my benches. So for the fire pit top, I measured out my inner and outer radius, and then I'm transferring that onto a sheet of melamine, the same as I did a few times earlier. And then I'm just taking some scrap cut-offs of 2x4 and screwing these in along the lines. I have some of these form edge liners that have a rock pattern on them, so I'm going to use these as the form walls, and the blocking should hold these in place once the concrete's poured in here. Now before I pour the concrete, I have some of this stamp release powder in gray color. And I'm just sprinkling this along the form as well as the walls so that the concrete will release from here fairly easily and have the same coloring as the stamp top. And then I mixed up a few more bags of that crack-resistant concrete. One bag filled this form about halfway, and then I put in some lengths of this fiberglass rebar in hopes that this will hold the slab together just while we carry it over to the fire pit. Once I had the form filled up, I used my fingers to go along and tap the edges to release any air bubbles or voids, and then used a trowel to smooth that out, and we'll let that set up for about an hour or two. Once it's set up to the point that you can still poke your finger into it, but it's no longer sticky, this should be ready for stamping. So I have this rubber slate textured stamp that I'm going to use to do all my stamping on these. So I sprinkled some stamp release powder over top of the concrete, and then went along with this stamp, tapping the texture into the surface. This is pretty much the exact same way you would stamp a concrete patio or driveway, just with bigger stamps. And this is the first time I've ever done anything like this, and it's pretty fun, so maybe I'll tackle a patio or something someday. A day later, I can remove my edge blocking and the walls, and rinse off all of the excess powder. And that's a pretty good looking artificial stone slab. Now to repeat that process with my 2 bench tops as well as the smaller tabletop. The release powder and the stamp and the edge forms were by far the most expensive part of this, costing a few $100. But once you have all that stuff, these slabs only cost like $20 a piece. And I have enough release powder to do many more projects in the future. So before I install these concrete tops, I have this smokeless fire pit ring that I got on Amazon that I'm going to line the inside of this concrete fire pit with. So this kit has 8 pieces that just bolt together in a circle, and then I have some construction adhesive that I'm using to glue this onto the concrete. So this ring has a diameter of 30 inches, and my concrete inner diameter is 32 inches, which is going to give this a 1-inch air pocket around the entire thing. This is actually what's going to aid in this being a smokeless fire pit. When the air is sucked in through those air intakes, the majority of air is going to come underneath this shell and feed the fire, but a percentage of that air is actually going to come in behind the steel ring and heat up where it's released through these top holes, which releases more oxygen into the fire and ideally burns up anything that was left to combust, i.e. smoke. That's the theory anyway. I'm not going too much into the science on this because there's tons of videos on smokeless fire pits on YouTube, so go watch one of them. I just like to make stuff look pretty. So on the fire pit, I'm adding a little bit of mortar to that top ring, and then setting my cast concrete top in place and just measuring that out to make sure it's even around all the edges. And then on the benches, the mortar won't really stick to the wood, so I'm using some of this polymer-based construction adhesive and laying out a liberal zigzag B to that before setting the top in place. Now the benches in the fire pit are 1 step shy of being fully completed. So the last step is applying the grout between the stones. So I mixed up some of this gray colored grout to a fairly watery consistency. Then I have one of these grout bags, so I filled that up with a few scoops of grout. And the reason you want this fairly watery is so that you can squeeze this and it kind of squirts out the end like that. So the grout's fairly straightforward to apply. You just squeeze it between the gaps of the stones until it's relatively full. Doesn't need to be perfect because we're going to come back and touch this up in a couple hours. It is a pretty dang good forearm workout though. So a couple hours have passed and that grout is set up just to the point where it's no longer watery or runny. So I'm taking one of these brick jointing tools and just going along the joints, kind of packing them in. And then I'll come back with this brush and even everything out and clean it up. So now I'm finally on to the patio. And before I start placing the stones, I have some of this edge guard that I'm putting around the full edge of the patio bed. And this is going to help keep the grass out, as well as just have a differentiating line between the patio and the grass. So now on to the patio stone. I chose this large oversized flagstone for a couple reasons. One, it's 2 inches thick, which is going to give me more room to put the LED strip light between the cracks as well as something to cover it up. And 2, just its overall size means we're going to have a lot less gaps and cracks than I would with normal flagstone, so that's going to mean a lot less LED lights and filling in the gaps. So a lot of these stones are really large and pretty much every one of them needed cut to some degree. So I'm just using this cheap 9-inch concrete saw that I got at Canadian Tire for a couple $100. And it actually made really easy work of cutting this. I would just go about halfway through and that would take maybe 30 seconds or a minute on a large cut like this. And then I'd either hammer off the excess or on a big piece, we'd just stomp them apart. Once we set a stone in place, we'd have to lift it up several times to get it level with the stones around it. And each one of these stones weighs like anywhere from 50 to 300 pounds, so this got quite taxing on the body after a few days. A lot of the time we'd have to just clean up the edges on a stone to make them fit a little nicer. Or some stones just had to be completely cut to shape, like this big one. After 3 or 4 days of some backbreaking stonework, the patio stones are finally laid. Now on to the last step, and likely the reason you clicked onto this video, setting up the LED lights to make this patio glow. So right now I have about a 2 or a 2 1/4 inch trench between my stones. And I could just put in the lights right away, but there's a couple problems with that. These smaller stones are still really loose and you can easily move them out of place because there's no jointing compound between the stones. Normally you just fill that gap all the way up with a jointing compound like this, but I need room for LED lights and some tempered glass in here, so I'm gonna have to get creative. So I'm actually just gonna fill this with about a 1/2 inch of this compound. And then I'm hoping that'll be enough to hold these stones rigidly in place. The large stones, which is most of them, I'm not too worried about because they're pretty tough to move. It's just the smaller ones I really want to lock in place here so you don't accidentally kick them and move them. Once I had that all filled in and most of the debris swept away, I used a leaf blower to blow off any of the excess dust. And then wet this compound down according to the directions on the bag. So now I have a fairly rigid connection between all the stones, and we can move on to the LED lights. So for the lights, I'm using these Govee RGB Pro lights that are normally meant to go around like a house or a deck, but this channel is all about bending the rules. These LEDs come fully encased in this silicone casing, which makes it fully splash proof, so I'm hoping that's going to be enough water protection to be underneath this patio. So I unrolled these LEDs roughly into all the cracks between the stones, and I ended up using 3 boxes of these strip lights. Each one of these boxes contains 3 separate 33-foot strips that connect together like so. I decided to use these lights because they're fairly programmable just through your phone, and they contain RGB as well as cool and warm white light diodes, so I can set this to any color as well as any temperature of true white instead of an RGB white that's usually a bluish color. They're also waterproof, which was obviously #1 factor. Once I had my strip lights roughly laid out, I'm going to fasten these down to the bottom of this trench using some landscape staples. I'm not hammering these in super tight that it puts any stress on the cable, just enough to hold them down. I used one of these staples about every foot or so, and that looks like it's holding it down nice and snug to the ground, so I can put something over top of it. So for the final touch on this build and to cover up my LED strip lights, I'm going to use this tempered fiberglass bead. I just picked up about 25 bags of this on Amazon, and I specifically picked some that doesn't have any sharp edges so that it's safe to walk over in bare feet. So I'm just going to fill this up in the joints over top of the strip light and hope that diffuses the light nicely. I'm just leaving these beads loose for now because I'm not sure if I'll have to work on the lights anymore or not. But once I'm confident this is a long-term solution, I'll use some mulch glue to glue these beads together so that they aren't moving around all the time. And that's it for this build. Let's wait for it to get dark. Well, this turned out way better than I was expecting. The smokeless fire pit works better than any fire pit I've honestly ever used. It didn't produce an ounce of smoke after the first 5 minutes. Obviously that's due to quality of lumber and a bunch of other things as well, but I've been burning this same wood for the last year, and I can honestly say I'm very impressed with this fire pit. I slowed down this clip and you can actually see that flame stretching over to the air holes where the fresh oxygen is being released into the fire. On top of that, the stone benches look awesome, and the LED lights make a really magical look that I've never really seen anywhere else before. I'm a fan of just the straight white, but the Govee app has all kinds of different patterns and colors, and you can play around with this. Damn, that's cool. Overall, I'm really happy with how this build turned out, and it's definitely another conversation piece for the old backyard. The total cost of this build was around $10,000 Canadian, most of that being the oversized flagstone and the stone veneer. If you like this video, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the subscribe button so you can see what I get building next, and leave me a comment with some more cool build ideas below if you have any. You can also follow me on my Instagram at DrewBuildStuff. Thanks so much for watching my video, and we'll see you next time.